It's worth saying, though, isn't it, that when that it's possible to be a very good and loving person when you're not even being authentic to yourself. I'm thinking of, there was someone who's, you quote in the book, I think a patient or someone that you knew, who their family referred to them as they were lovely, they were wonderful, they just fitted in with everyone all the time, they blended into the background, and they were so loving and supporting. So they were a genuinely lovely person, but at enormous cost to themselves. How does that happen? What kind of person is that?
Well, I'm reminded of the TV series The Crown, and Queen Elizabeth's father, the late Queen Elizabeth's father, whose nickname was Bertie, was one of these people that was the Queen Mom says about him after he died that he was just a perfect son. He never thought of himself at all, you know. And very loving, very nurturing to everybody else but himself. And those are the people that get cancer, by the way, very often. And so the love that you describe, David, flows towards others, but love is supposed to be a two-way valve. It's supposed to flow in both directions. When it only flows towards others and you ignore your own needs, then you're taking on way too much stress in this life, and it's going to tell on your health. So nothing wrong with loving others. We're meant to do that. But when we're loving others by chronically suppressing our own needs, where we are always afraid of disappointing others, where our own needs are compulsively ignored, that's a quick route to disease.
And it is that connection with disease which shines through the book a lot. I mean, particularly, as you said, that there's a personality type, the type that's always helping someone else, particularly in women, has a high rate of cancer. But then you also talk about that self, I think you call it self-abnegating, is associated with an enormous number of autoimmune diseases, which, as you point out in the book, the rise in autoimmune diseases, arthritis and diabetes, cannot be explained genetically or by any other means, really. How is it, in your view, that a physical disease, which modern medicine would say, oh, well, we'll just cure that with a pill, can flow from these early lessons in childhood?
Sure. So when you mention autoimmune disease and women, 70–80% of autoimmune disease happens to women, which is an incredible proportion. And if you look at something like multiple sclerosis, the gender ratio back in the 30s was about 1:1, but now it's more than 3 women for every man. And you can't explain it, as you say, genetically, because genes don't change in a population over 80 years. And so something's going on here. Now, it so happens that here's where you have to understand the mind-body unity. Like, again, this is one of those well-kept scientific secrets. I mean, scientifically, there's no doubt, in fact, it's beyond doubt, that mind and body are inseparable, that the emotional apparatus in the brain and the immune system and the hormonal system and the nervous system are not even separate systems that are connected. They're one unit, different manifestations of the same unit. So let's take something like anger. You mentioned a child who can't escape or fight back, but as an adult, if I were to intrude on your space in a hostile or threatening way, at some point, you'd want to get angry with me. My space, get out. That's healthy anger. So healthy anger is a boundary defense. It just keeps you from being invaded and being intruded upon. We have a circuit in our brain for anger. Anger is not a bad thing. All animals have a circuitry, all mammals have anger circuitry in their brain. Why? Because it helps them defend their territories. You're in my space, get out. It's healthy. In fact, it prevents conflict. Because if I mount a big anger display, we might not come to blows. So anger is a boundary defense, right? So what is the role of the immune system? It's a boundary defense. The immune system keeps out that which is unhealthy and toxic and bacteria and so on, and allows in nutriments and vitamins and healthy bacteria, whatever is good for health. So both the immune system and the emotional system have the same role, you see, to let in what is nurturing and to keep out what is toxic. That's the role of the emotional system. That's the role of the immune system. Given that they're the same unit, they're not separate. When something happens emotionally, it's going to have an impact on the immune system as well. So the people that suppress themselves emotionally because they're programmed to do so, not because it's their fault, but because that's how they survived their childhoods. Those people that suppress their emotions, then naturally it's going to have an impact on the immune system, and it does. So the immune system will either fail to protect you, or it'll actually, just like anger that you repress, turns against you in the form of self-loathing and self-criticism and shame. In the same way, the immune system can turn against you. Now you got autoimmune disease. And if you look at it from the cultural point of view, which group in this society is a culture related to take on other people's stresses, to swallow their own needs, not to express them, not to be angry, to take on responsibility for looking after their partners and their families. It's women. That's one of the patriarchal determinations of the female role in this society. Any wonder then that women are much more prone to autoimmune disease. And I can tell you, it was here in London in 2018 that I gave a talk at a conference saying some of these same ideas. And there's a young woman there with a disease called lupus. Lupus is an autoimmune disease which attacks multiple organs in the body. In her case, amongst other manifestations, it showed up in this butterfly rash on her face, and her fingers were white as chalk because the circulation was impaired. And she came to this talk and she got it. She's all her life has been pursuing attachment over authenticity, always denying her own needs. Of course she was told, because physicians don't understand any of this. They don't know what I'm talking about. As a profession, I mean, only because they're not taught the science. So my knock on my profession isn't that there's too much science, there's not enough science. There's a huge swath of science that we just don't ignore, that we ignore. So, her name is Valentina. This woman, I have liberty to talk about her. She was told that you got this autoimmune disease, we don't know what causes it, there's nothing we can do about it, we can give you strong medications to control it for the rest of your life. 4 years later, she's off medications, her color is as normal as it gets, and she's functioning beautifully. And I know many such examples, because she changed her emotional relationship to herself. She stopped ignoring her own needs and serving the needs of others automatically. Her physiology responded. Now, I'm not offering a magic cure here, but I know so many such cases. And of course, that's what I would expect. If I understand that the mind and body are one, then if I change, not if I develop better thoughts, but if I actually work through my trauma and change my emotional relationship to myself, so I show up in the world differently, of course I can expect that to have an impact on my physiology. And in so many cases it does. So these aren't purely theoretical considerations. I'm talking about people's actual health here.
And it does give you a very different view of what disease is, as you say in the book. Disease isn't necessarily an invasion of your life from something outside, but at least a significant part of it is a manifestation of something that's in you. And because it's in you, you can do something about it.
That's the whole point, David. So, and language is very important, how we talk about things. So, when we say, I have cancer, or I have ADHD, or I have depression, or I have rheumatoid arthritis, there's an assumption in that way of talking. It's very normal to talk about it in those terms, but there's an assumption there. The assumption is that there's this thing, there's an entity called the disease, then there's another entity, me, and this entity, me, has this other entity. So I have this glass. The glass has got nothing to do with me. It's not part of me. It's not a manifestation of who I am. It's simply an object that I have. I can use it, put it down, give it away, shatter it. That's not going to change me in any way at all. But what if disease is not an entity that has a life of its own? What if disease, like when you go to a doctor and say, you got this disease, here's the prognosis. That assumes that the life of disease is of its own, which is totally independent of your life. It's a thing that you have. It's an entity that somehow entered you, and now you have it. But what if it's not an entity? What if it's a process? What if it's a process that manifests your life? What if it's a process that manifests how you were carried in your mother's womb, what happened to you as a child, what beliefs you developed about yourself? What if it reflects your relationships with the world, with your community, with your family, with your culture? And above all, what if it manifests your relationship to yourself? That it's a process that manifests all these dynamics. It then follows that if you change that relationship to yourself, you can have an impact on that process that the disease represents. And that's what I believe is actually going on. It's a process, it's not a thing, it doesn't have a life of its own necessarily. I'm not saying everything is curable, it's just not that simple, but it is a process, and insofar as you change what goes into that process, you can have significant influence on that process in many, many, many cases. And you can certainly prevent it from coming on by understanding this.